Hey, hey, how you doing? Okay, so um, been considering the nature of truth and logos and contradiction and the metaphysical claims that are attributed to these things, and the adherence to the history of our lexicon, our logos, everything that's built around what it is we say that we claim, the utility of our words and how we function, regardless of whether or not the referent is metaphysical or whether or not it's in the eidetic realm, or whether or not it's pragmatic and utilitarian and a matter of empirical referencing, object referencing, the questioning of essence, right? And then this idea that the historic idea, right, that comes down to, I don't know, like Bronze Age, perhaps individuals that meaning that language and life, trying to stay vital in one's being, to the idea of living, the idea of living well, the idea of functioning, the idea of what it would mean to have dysfunction or incorporate dysfunction, or to assume that there's a type of para-alignment with that which is vital and that which is just not vital, or not. It's like it's aligned with that which is vital, or promoting one's life, and then that which you might say is hedonistic for hedonistic sake, or that which has no particular utility, things that are found in leisure or meditative gazings. Anyway, and so all of this is stemming from kind of this huge rebuke that I have against in a way, positioning oneself, right? The idea, the very act of positioning oneself in their mind, right, as if what it is that they claim and what it is that they know is the case, right? If you think of Kurt Cobain's line, all we are is what we know, right? Even though he says those in triads, all we are is what we know, all we are is what we know, all we are is what we know. And you compare that to, I don't know, I came up with just a general statement when affronted with the idea of the philosophical and general genre engaged generally, initially at probably the age of maybe 22-ish, I would say, right? Which is, the problem with people is that they believe what they think, right? So there's this adherence that we have, right? It's just, it goes unquestioned, it goes unassumed, but there's this adherence that we have that one must or should retain a kind of an outline of what it is they believe, and that they should hold themselves to that, and that they should do that for the previously mentioned reasons, right? That it's good for utility, it's good for one's life, it's good for the idea of living one's life. And I'm not I'm not out of hand trying to deny that, right? But this wholesale swallowed wholesale notion that one's position on almost any topic does not have some running alongside, or running alongside is like not quite the white of a yolk to the shell, but more of that slight membrane just inside of the shell, I guess you could say, or the calcified shell that separates the white from the shell. Almost like the enamel of the tooth functions partially as a sliding barrier to the gum, or something to that effect, right? So, I've been thinking, that the hallmark of the Western tradition, in the theological tradition, is that truth is at apex, right? It's the apex. I don't know, it's at apex, and that one should strive for this, right? And that by acquiring this, then one claims the position, and then they claim the context of that position, and then they identify with the context of that position, and then they further their arguments, right? So because of this notion, the problem is that there seems as if there's always variance, right? So what I was saying is that truth theologically is generally considered at apex, and contradiction, or that thing that composes either a narrative or another point of view that does not attempt to accrue itself to an apex, to a truth, right, becomes antithetical, and hence it's of the adversary theologically, right? It is of Satan, so to speak, right? Anyway, you could look at Americana, Americanism, consumerism, the idea of our American politics, Israel as our client state, and the money, and our ecology of economy, if you will, that we're embedded in, right? And you can say, well, these are elements that we have to live within, so we must sacrifice I don't know, our ideals, our truths, if you will, chop down the apex in order to survive or cultivate or live, to be vivacious. This all, the idea that one is within an environment that requires a curtailing of one's being is meaning one can then reframe the immediate temporal ground, their presence relative to that, right? Instead of looking at themselves as like a history or a multiple chronos of being, but just like saying, okay, at this point, everything that's gathered, this is the event that I have to deal with, as if your life is always entering into some sort of matrix video game, and it's your job in order to survive and survive well and have success, right? So there's all of these different narratives and imaginations throughout Hollywood, throughout video games, throughout media. And I'm generally a proponent of accepting all of them, meaning it's weird. It's not that I don't have an ethic where I find disgust or I find things that I'm anti-sympathetic to. Those exist, but the idea of allowing an inclusion, allowing a contradiction, a negation of the apex, right? A negation away from truth questing seems as if it is very, very important, right? People, once again, they swallow certain things wholesale, right? For example, I had to go through what I found, like, this is way back when, in 2010, a denial of gravity in a way, without having a denial of it, meaning I incorporated a denial of gravity in my mind, like trying to substitute that truth of gravity in my mind, right? And leapt like Satan tempting Christ, right? Look, jump off this ledge, the angels will certainly grab you, right? I had that same thought in this multi-layered readjustment of a denial of gravity and then an acceptance of gravity, but sort of a savior element or something that would keep me from this. It'd come into play. And yet there was, and so in other words, if I took on a Christ-like role, and that element of thought that was in my mind that was allowing these both accepting of truth and then an element of something super radical that would come in and support my denial of the truth of gravity, if you will, right? As well as just an outright denying gravity, right? Those as a complement help set forth my being and able to deny it and thrust myself off of off of a building, hence, shattering my body. but in terms of describing, or my feet and my spine, right, and messing with a lot of other aspects of my being, right, like, meaning I'm not promoting it, I'm not recommending it, but what I'm suggesting is that the act of doing it, that there was a compunction, there, put it this way, accepting one truth and then using that truth as a mean to subjugate what you might also hold as truth in another domain, right? So let me take the physical argument of in physics, every equal and opposite reactions, right? So if I deny gravity and I subjugate my body to this break, plus the act of allowing the contradiction to occur, to thwart my sense of vitality into a metaphysical realm, if you will, right? The very act of doing that, and then the act of breaking the body, hence yielded another awareness, meaning, so the equal and opposite reaction was that the act of this denial, a kind of a sacrificing of the structure of my body and sacrificing a dependency on always trusting what would one say, the uniformity, the laws such as gravity, a uniformity of nature that bears out the laws of gravity and so forth. In a denial of these rudiments, there was still the import of kind of a metaphysical equal and opposite reaction. And by that, I mean, I make the claim that in 2007, I saw alongside with my girlfriend, and what I would say is a breach in reality. It was an empirical orb that moved through my apartment, right? And then after my jump in 2011, roughly a year later, then, so to speak, the writing on the wall, the tea leaves of my environment, developed their own type of meta language, a logos of fracturing pieces. I come from an aesthetics background, so I come from the idea of what are elements in people's paintings, like symbolically, like what could they mean? What could colors mean? How are they associated, right? And so anyway, and so in 2011, I was driven up to, meaning I was pulled up there by an association of fractured symbols, not just symbols to themselves appearing in different tempos, but in the idea of how it is we concretize what it is we say that we know, right? I mean, you can look at your spatial empirical world. You can doubt that, like it would be interesting for me to doubt that my hand is closer to the screen than my face, right? Especially when I'm doing this, like optically, bioptically, binocularly, I mean, we utilize our senses to help generate our spatial locality, right? Our position in space, right? We assume this is part of our biology. To doubt this would be to frame it in a static position, and then you, believing my hands are closer to you than my face, you could imagine that the shape of my face is cut out like a paper tiger, so to speak, and is actually closer to you physically than my hands. I mean, so that's a different type of reapproach, a denial of one's spatial empirical positioning, right? What I'm referring to by reading the tea leaves of one's environments isn't just to be inspired by like a billboard or see something on a bumper sticker or something in a movie or something in music or any other form of communication, but a associative kind of like coming to an understanding of one's symbolic, one's being's metaphysical symbolic positioning within this, right? And a lot of people at this point find no or very little from this. They're not able to extract the writing on the wall as having any sort of congruous context. I think this is either an attribute. I mean, I could say, oh, it's their awareness. I don't like to use intelligence, but maybe like hyper IQ people. And this, I'm not meaning to like impose that or grant that attribute to myself, but I'm not denying it of myself either. But the point is that whatever it was that allowed not only an awareness of the symbols to take on kind of this meaning, but to find that my like placing myself within it, that I was able in a way to read, at least at particular times, directives, meaning organizational directives from my environment, right? That brought me up to Montana, that brought me up to what I saw up in Montana, which was another breach in reality. And I mentioned this in a painting, this huge electric jellyfish-looking elongated star that was hovering about 15, 20 feet above the highway late at night, that seemingly had nothing to do with anything that I could ever imagine existing. It seemingly had no connection with anything that I would say, science generally observes. There's no credibility, meaning there's no testimony. They're like in the orb. There's nothing that I could say about the occurrence of this thing that wouldn't have me believe that it was anything other than supernatural, alien, other, right? Like the orb. The only difference was that the orb was a shared experience. It was a communal experience, right? We had dialogues about how this was so out of the ordinary, where in this case I was alone, right? So what brought me to it, and then I found myself in fear and I drove under it. And the reason I guess I bring up the whole notion of one's positions relative to their empirical, their physiological relationship to their spatial world, right, is because the only way for me to verify that I wasn't just having a psychological projected imagination experience was by the act of driving under it and then seeing it in two mirrors and over my shoulder again, right, as this object. Not and because I was able to, when I saw it in the mirror, I even told myself, like, yes, it's there. Yes, it's there. Yes, it's there. I know I'm not going mad, right? This is existing, but it's outside of my realm of understanding. So these two particular empirical instantiations that occurred within my life were highly impactful, right, in terms of what it is I might believe about aliens or gods or supernatural intelligent entities, right, which doesn't dissuade God, but it's this idea of how to put it. It brought up the parsing away the distinction between like it's ironic and it's contradictory, right? That the elements in my environment allowed kind of this collusion to come about that led me to this entity, right? Because of that collusion of association, I want to parse away the idea of association of meaning as one believes it must be, to believe what I think, right? And that the problem with people is that they believe what they think of my own accord, right? And yet at the same time, there's kind of, in the moment, a means of not being able to disassociate one's associations of meaning, right? And there's a kind of pathology that comes over, schizophrenics, and that's what I was diagnosed with, have an adherence to maintaining these what semi-sane people would not pull together as kind of cherry-picked associations that come to have these particular meanings, right? So already, this is culminated in my worldview and in my trying to reinvestigate the history of philosophy and esoteric philosophies and so forth, and just listening to people, in order to see if to what extent theology impregnates itself into that which I experienced empirically and that which I experienced associatively. So I'm trying to parse out the difference between that which is registered as an empirical thing or entity or appearance, those things that one focuses upon. They're not merely in one's periphery. So you trust them. I remember I said I trusted this ore, but like I trusted seeing my hand, right? And perhaps, and I shouldn't have said that, but I mean I trusted it as much as I trust seeing this particular cup, right? So I was trying to grant it over its presence in the physical domain, not even in the material domain, because it seemed like it was merely an energetic thing. Same thing with the entity up in Montana. Nonetheless, these are just prefaces, but it has me parsing out the idea, because when the orb showed up, just to give you guys this longer narrative, which you may have heard, after it had gone through the wall and disappeared, and my girlfriend and I were just going, going out of our minds. About 20 minutes later, she gets a phone call from her dad saying that her granddad had died. And immediately then she associated that information, the temporal occurrence of the information, to the empirical. And I did too. Immediately I granted it, and then I had to parse it away. And so one of my notions about things is what it is that we grant, and then what it is we parse away, right? So the acceptance of exegesis as opposed to eisegesis, right? Exegesis out of biblical texts, right? This is the majority of where people confound themselves to their foundations of theology. They're inheriting stories of somebody else's declared miraculous or supernatural happenings, occurrences, intendings, or facts that seem out of this world, right? And then they take the whole of the narrative, and through eisegesis, pulling of this, they are coming to certain theological conclusions, and that they embed these conclusions. It's easy to absorb this, right? Where the atheist generally eschews this, thwarts this, pushes this away, right? These are things like, look, I'm aware that these are, right? They're highly aware that these are but these are stories, right? And so they have no business adhering to these inherited stories, no matter how many other people do, no matter what the populations of people do. They have no business to that, right? And I, at one point, had no business with that myself. But then the empirical knowledge of these two supernatural events, not to mention other that I would say less than supernatural, meaning I could give a physical explanation as to why these were occurring, meaning there seemed as if there could be a physical explanation, but the majesty of the event itself, the occurrence of the event itself seems so abnormal, even though it could be described within the physical domain, that I'm not granting that over to the conversation as being important, or this particular monologue. Anyway, so along with all of these like notions of compartmentalizing an empirical knowledge here, and an associative kind of acceptance, or kind of before I go there, the idea of exegesis and pulling and believing and adhering to inherited canonized texts as the case, right? regardless of what Abrahamic religion you are, any religion that you are, if one does not take their experience of life, and I don't mean this phenomenologically, right? I don't mean the entire emotive, one's conscious sense as a whole, but meaning strictly a kind of a deflating consciousness into empiricism, or that which is of the empirical world. I'm even reluctant to use these terms. God, that was the one I was thinking of. And there's really no reason for me to hurry my thoughts here. Yeah, I was trying to use, I believe, gnosis for knowledge, and like theos for theology, gnosis for knowledge, that type of thing. And I thought I don't want to stack the Latin with the modern for the sake of expressing some sort of like high-minded intellectual capability. I don't. There's the practice of doing so it's interesting. I'm not trying to defame anyone that's doing it. I just don't particularly want to accord myself to it. Plus the definitions, and perhaps it wasn't even that definition that I was looking at. It's just that this presumed archaic use is somehow associated with my modern conviction that I'm able to communicate what it is I'm saying to you through these words. It is not needed. What my story is not. I'm not expecting anyone to believe my story. I'm not asking the listener to adhere to my claims as if they are the case, because these are radically miraculous kind of odd stories. My wanting to make a video was more about wanting to put the phrase paraconsistent logic, right? Embedded contradiction, right? To say that the adversary of truth and righteousness in God is Satan, right? And that Satan is doing anything that he, whatever pronoun attribute you want to give to this theological story, is in contra to the truth. That the logos is logic, and logic itself is the pure reasoning formalization, formalized structure of communal relations that seems as if it can take on, like science can utilize the spoils of this in order to start composing what it is it holds as its basic dependencies in which to further the science. So I feel bad because I'm not finding the exact words that I want. Anyway, and so what it is that I've been working on for several years now, just in terms of these very blown apart, very sparse ideas, right? That I'm trying to bring together, trying to edit through them, trying to take out the woo, trying to take out the story of, and allow some sort of not just a inclusion of the truth alongside an inclusion of contradiction, right? And so that contradiction can allow a variance, or one to bring themselves to an apositionality, right? To deposition, deplatform, defound, unfound, defoundational logics, right? Especially in the modern day. I mean, this idea of, like, you take certain people that are like, well, they're taking things in a polarized binary of policy and saying, well, these are the left and these are the right, and here's what the left's doing and here's what the right's doing in terms of these political narratives, and trying to give these grander narratives and then sparse through their claims about what they say is the case. and they're generating these new sub pockets, new narratives that thwart and kind of overshadow the maintained narrative, or kind of like the cultural thrusted narrative. Not just culturally thrusted as if people are propagandizing these, but cultural thrust as in that it's taught throughout time, right? But so they're developing these, but nonetheless they're still adhering to these. And the idea, first the idea would to bring one to and through down to ashes, atomizing absolutely everything that they believe is the case, meaning moving oneself into insanity. So defoundational, promoting contradiction, should bring one into a type of nihilism, right? But we want to make certain that this is a constrained exercise, especially for those that don't have the experience of anything that they would claim is supernatural. They might have like ghostly apparitions or things that they could chalk up to psychology, that they don't want to say are of any otherly dimension, right? Even the idea of like solipsism or universal monism of one's self as center of all cosmic things is problematic, right? Meaning it's almost to say, I guess what I'm saying is that it doesn't seem as if there's nothing that isn't problematic, right? They're all positions seem as if they come alongside a counter position, an alternative position, an otherly position. So trying to then formulate inverse opposites, trying to embed contradiction through not just paraconsistent logic, which allows kind of a debatable agnosticism to arise, but to give a, an a not a categories of intersection, such that you have both the case and not the case occurring, but then neither both the case and not the case occurring elements to it. This oddly enough, and in contradiction to what I was saying, this seems more appropriate to me intuitively than anything else that I've ever heard anyone else speak on. So I want to say that an apositionality, if someone says, oh, what's your position on this? I can both argue on more of a grounded foundational sense and give them a general opinion about where I might tend when I'm in my practical utilitarian universe, where I would land on something. In contra to that, if I'm being most sincere, I can step back like on a covalent bond, right? You have your nucleus of the protons and neutrons, and then you have the covalent levels, right? These greater covalences, like in an egg yolk, you got the yolk, then you get the whites, and then you get that shelly film, and then you get the shell, and then you get the context of the egg, that type of thing, right? And you can have injections within any of those areas or domains from the outside, and you can break open the egg and make your omelet or whatnot, right? So by that same accord, I want to rest on the idea of migrational positionings. And so migrational positionings allow one not only to empathize with what they believe is contra or counter or opposite, but an attempt to regain like a self-psychological realm where one has to extract certain attributes of what they consider truth and noble in one area compared to another. If you compare like veganism to vegetarianism, and you have this brawl between any manipulation of any animal, right? And you compare maybe veganism to the religions that don't want to harm any bugs or damage anything by the individual's intent. there's kind of a mode of idealism that comes into play there, meaning that one will absorb and kill bacteria just by breathing. Right? And so there is some limitation to these arguments. But the idea of parsing away any categories from any subcategories. But what I was going to bring up was if you compare hunters and non-hunters, or hunters and vegetarians, if you will, right? In order to empathize with the hunter, you have to inflate and maintain their, well, you don't have to, how to put it, the thrill of the hunt, that phrase, right? This actionable, beastly, predatory activity included in the synthetic attributes of humanity's being able to invent a gun, and then, or a bow and arrow, and then positioning one's ontic position to the weapon as presencing itself, as being within your being, and then one's ethical domains being allowed to migrate and shift such that hunting then takes on this particular role, right, as a type of accepted sort of sadism against this particular species. That becomes not only a trait, but considered a noble trait. Then to fight larger game or more ferocious animals takes on different inherited ethics, the fox hunt, or to hunt a lion or hunt a bear, or things that are on endangered species lists, to go out and, do these particular reserve huntings on controlled lands in Africa in order to hunt a lion that's half domesticated, that you're not really in peril with, and, like assume that there's some grand nobility of taking one's selfie or a photo with the defeated animal, right? So you take on, you wonder of what allows other human beings to do what it is you yourself seem partially, perhaps self-constrained away from, and you try to embody it. This same discourse. Right, and the idea of the dialectics, the debate, and or the trying to come to compromise and agreement. I even want to run a contra against that. Like, how do we invert that such that one is not formulating a dialectic coming from a position, but one already is including the other one's position? So in one way, if one recognizes themselves holding and being able to define a position, then they should figure out what rails they're on that has them holding these, right? And what their own limits, or to what extent they will move themselves at the center of the position to the periphery of that position. Right, in order, like a covalent bond, once again, in molecules, right? The nucleus, and then the first covalent, and the second covalent. And covalent bonds are occurring with other molecules that are sharing that electral domain, right? And so the act of, when one wants to say we're in discourse, the dialectic is actually, I like the analog of the covalent bond. All of a sudden now you're sharing an electron that actually surrounds the other one's position, and hence you are the bond. Now you're the totality of the bond before you once again separate and you regroup. But this is what it means to be considerate and conscientious of. Like, okay, I eat meat now again after a year of vegetarianism, other than my Kiev getting beaten for a day and a half and them giving me a burger and me eating a burger, right? For ethics reasons, I had bounded to the idea of, I don't want to be a drop of poison in the contribution to the industrial death of animals, right? And then finding physiological symptoms that could be related to lack of B12 or lacks of proteins, kind of my lack of applying these things I like started to migrate away from. So I could say that any given time I'm holding a position, right? And I'm going to say I want to remain as a migrational positionalist, if you will, or an apositionalist, other than the position of being an English speaker that has this lexical field that I'm able to convey this information to you, whether or not you want to chalk it up to nonsense or word salad. All of the disciplines, the idea of what is knowledge, and then the kind of the module, right? I'm speaking as I write my text. Well, what do we speak about knowledge? And instead of looking at it as a necessary gravitation of or accumulation of truth functions that yield one to these positions, I'm thinking these are modular, truth as module, right? Such that like to say this cup is solid, right? Hey, this is a solid cup, right? What are the components that make up the solidity of the cup, right? What is adhering to what, and why do I consider it a solid cup, right? There's the essence, there's the apprehension, there's the uniform nature of it seemingly being able to be re-grabbed and retested. But then what are the constituent parts, right? And so the idea of knowledge, propositional knowledge. Well, first of all, let me back up a sec before I get to knowledge. The idea that logic and truth are apex and paramount, and they're most important, and the drive to these things, other than for strict utility of, oh, I have kids and I need to move through life, and recognizing one's sense of their ecology economically and their acquisition of this, and then one's more humanistic intellectual desires and so forth. Like one can place what it is that they're coalescing as a module to justify why it is they're maintaining their particular positions. So the whole idea is, how do you separate off and allow collusion of these ideas, these modular rudiments to hold together, right? And so there's this idea that the logos and logic, that somehow that Aristotle and Plato, and then logic throughout time, does not have its own history of development, right? That some of it is gender oriented, some of it is enculturated in behavior, right? It wasn't such a like a Platonic form or language as the eidetic referent, right? The sign, the signified in the mind, right? That the proposition of an excluded middle that would be, I guess, the vibrations of what I'm saying, as they're in transit to you electronically or whatnot. I could say there's an excluded middle to the performance of my speaking the language, and I can reference language as an object as opposed to that which I am signified and articulating, and the one that you're hearing, and that this is all like the notion of the inner subjective, right? So even that, the idea of trying to defend that language is in contra, it's both an inner subjective domain, right here. It's this intersection of subjectives, but it's also an exterior referent that we can speak about, or we can speak about it in terms of it presenting itself as graphemines and text and other symbols of content, right? So the idea that logic didn't have a history and didn't change, and that the logic then is the logic now, and the reasons then are the reasons now, that one holds truth as apex in this quest to always accumulate oneself towards this truth. Almost the idea of a steeple on a church, right? And the churches start here, and then they move up, and then the idea of the steeple is almost the most acute geometry of where one wants to believe the logos is, and they point to God, so to speak. Meaning even these attributes, like as opposed to a sweat lodge type of theological exercise that might be a less of a teepee and more of a Duomo or a rounded skin layered roof. Changes the geometry. And so the reference of apex is also employing and trying to generate an idea of a type of geometry, which I am utilizing in the book also in terms of tangents and stellations, and then using analogs to speak about migrating one's positions from, I guess, secular pragmatic metaphysical naturalistic positions to more what they would consider esoteric, mystical, supernatural, otherly theological notions. The attributions of what these domains are is what I both find problematic and I don't find problematic. So as I'm administering that which is contra, I have to deny my denials and I have to accept those. So I have to take errors as errors in one respect, and then I have to overshadow the errors in another respect. But anyway, so back to knowledge. Knowledge as propositional. This reduction, I think, by itself is problematic. The idea that knowledge is, like people will promote the idea, well, knowledge is justified true belief, right? And then you try to talk about the domains of knowledge relative to belief, and then the domains of certainty relative to knowledge. And you can talk of these as spectral differences. Well, certainty is, I could argue, and I'll contend in debates if people are saying certainty is meaning like the absence of doubt, so to speak. Not just the absence of doubt, but I'll posit the binary, right? Of, well, because some people will say knowledge is a subset of belief, and then I'll say, well, when is knowledge not a subset of belief, right? And then I'll attempt to answer that question, that they shore up or possibly shore up at the same at the same diameter, so to speak. They shore up the same. And then once one is convicted of having a knowledge about something, if there's not the implement of doubt as a binary to knowledge, then one could say one knows something without believing it. Meaning, these aren't to strictly be rhetorical or semantic or, how to put it, sophist. It's not mere sophistry, right? But it is to figure out what, like it back. Now I'm getting scrambled because there's just a lot going on. But okay, so let me focus. Let me bring back into the discourse, right? Kind of a narrowing so that I'm not too far running too many things, such that in my mind there's a sense, but to the listener it's becoming a blender and hence word salad. My argument would be that knowledge could come in different brands, so that you're not relying on certain historically accepted Western philosophically reduced notions that what is the case about knowledge is, for example, justified true belief. That one could speak of knowledge as things that are justified, things that are true, and or one believes, and that certainty is more of a graduating condition of confidence, right? From belief to knowledge to confidence, ultimate confidence, and that these restructuring what is accepted has been an exercise of my being, over the last many years, right? Attempting to re-articulate and restructure and reform these differing modules, competing modules, erector sets of difference, if you will, in order to run a new, I'll say, dialogic frame around what is accepted, to show that the adherence to one set of claims has a layer of divergence, or a tangential layer of something otherly that one could migrate their thoughts to, right? And so I'm not, if someone says, well, is your position dileotheism? Well, anleotheism, I can include that in. So if somebody attempts to compartmentalize my position, I both want to give them something, and at the same time, I don't want to give them something. Oh, I'm not a dileotheist because I'm pro-contradiction. I'm not a dileotheism because I'm neither pro nor not pro-contradiction, right? Anyway, to bring this all back to the embedded theological binaries of good and bad, or Christ is that, or God is that which is true and pure and rational and logical. To believe, to adhere to that, and then to watch oneself, any individual that adheres to that will eventually get to this break-off point where they themselves cannot comprehend all that is lesser than this extrapolation of their belief that they ascribe to God, as they're witnessing themselves adhere to what they believe man should adhere to, while pointing, right? They're just left in a point, right? And their point, though, is something like, hey, here's the acuteness of my thought, and the point of the steeple points up to God, the other that we can't entirely wrap ourselves around, or something. And then they can manifest whatever historic, lexical field that they want to inherit back down to the self. So as I'm parsing away the idea of exegesis and associative thought versus empirical apprehensions, and then kind of backing through the Kantian, moving more to the Merleau-Ponty kind of body as center, body, not mind center, but body center, there's something to be said. I'm wanting to cover a lot of topics, but I'm not indexing the contents very well. So as you can see, as you can hear, I'm a bit over the map. I'm actually turning my head away from the screen because somebody's typing in the screen. I'm trying to not read what they're typing right now. So let me just move that screen over. Okay, so so back to the idea that which is good is that which is rational, and that which is logical, and that which is appropriate, as opposed to what one deems would happen to a destabilized psychology in terms of nihilism, breakdown, importing the idea of nonsense in thoughts, logically explosive adherence, behaviors that seem random and not known as to why somebody is walking on all fours, banging their head against the bottom of a tree, thinking they're going to fall into Alice in Wonderland, and then hearing other elements, or jumping off of roofs, and or doing outlandish behaviors that you would attribute to maybe a meth junkie or somebody else, even though meth is a very clarifying kind of approach to one's empiricism, I believe. But so anyway, you take the idea that God are all of these attributes, and as if God adheres to reason and logic, as opposed to just humans using reason and logic to affix a pointing mechanism to God, is where I think a disjunct needs to be given to high IQ, theological intellectuals, not in a denial of their God, but more in a, can you not reappropriate your knowledge to pointing to that which you believe you understand. Christopher Michael Langan, or Michael Christopher Langan, whoever this supposed high IQ man is, developed the idea of kind of a manifold, right? And Wittgenstein had lined up a manifold of one's consciousness as it relates to the universe. And so like a manifold in a car, kind of a covering. It's like hot crock cooking, right? So you have these ricocheting ideas that if one sees something occur in their universe or in their mind, that there may be a referent that will show up either in simultaneous, in the very moment, in a simultaneous nature, or shortly to come, or in a diachronic nature. If one seeks to find, like I was caught into some numerological, 3s and 6s and 9s, and the idea of 6 being the beastly number, or the fire signs, and then moving into astrological associations with what are considered like the basic elements, water and earth and fire and air, or even thinking of the band Earth, Wind, and Fire, and where's their water, right? Or something to this effect, right? And then making these associative connections, I can find a yield there, meaning there is a yield through raw association. Oh, sorry, I have to apologize to whomever was listening, because I'm going on an hour now, so I'm gonna try to cut it short. But what I really wanted to drive at was the idea of trying to it's granting oneself over an allowance to confounding a defoundationalism in their being, not to scatter them into insanity, although I believe that is a type of chaotic firing that one should go through and emerge from without, like the phoenix, if you will, or like the born again, if you will. But this wasn't to be a recommendation of theological form. It was to more or less, if I concretize the good and the bad and say that Satan is that which is evil, right? And that Satan is that which is contrary to the truth, right? Then to be pro-contradiction would be to associate myself with some sort of satanic, like, configuration, presencing. I want to both accept that, but then deny that, in kind of the Nietzschean, if one is hunting monsters, you don't want to become a monster yourself, right? Here's another association that echoes by having the name Michael, right? Then I'm associated with Archangel Michael. Well, somebody had misconstrued Michael as being one of Satan's warriors that wars against God. And I was like, well, no, Michael is godlike, warring against Satan. So then there was this notion of the gap feel, right? Like if you want to insulate your floorboards, you run something along the floorboards to gap feel, right? Where Satan might be the breeze that moves the poisonous exterior wind into the house, or something like that, as a metaphoric analog. And so the idea is to denote the lexicon and the maneuvering capabilities that certain individuals have in order to find the exceptions to every rule that one has, right? And I guess what I'm saying is I'm implementing this for what appears to be a greater degree of indexing the minutia of gaps and differences and imbrocated tangents sliding apart, like pulling a tile off of one's roof, you rip away the tangent that tile had with the tangent above it, or with the tile above it. You've slid something apart. You're deconstructing that. And then it's to demystify the negation of the value. Like, oh, that is negative, right? It's to demystify the notion of what one adheres to as necessarily negative. But it's not to defame that which people do put together, which works for them and makes sense to them, that they find noble and virtuous, right? And so it's indexing all of the gap fills, assuming that a spiritual entity, if you will, like in the Abrahamic binaries of good and bad, or God and the devil, as opposed to poly notions of compartmentalized genres of value, I guess you could say. It would be the notion of indexing all of the holes in one's house to thwart off the negative as much as one could. But the insistence that one shouldn't move into dangerous or volatile domains is something that perhaps, I don't know, I think a lot of people that are coldly intellectual and logistic, if you will, and adhering to the Western canon are actually, they're weak. They're weak individuals. They meaning they're not thrusting themselves into compromising situations which have consequence, and I'll even say unknown consequence to their metaphysical or soulful being, their psychological being. And because they won't cast themselves into these precarious situations, they remain, I don't know what to say. They simply live careful lives, and that they're okay with that. And I believe people should be less okay with that and cast themselves bravely into things that they might not know what's on the opposite side, at least as long as they have the metabolism to do so. And this may be an unwise idea to promote, and yet I believe it's an adventurous and wisdom-filled, an expansion of wisdom, not a maintenance of inherited wisdoms or wisdoms pulled from exegesis, from texts. And yet I'm also not trying to defame that. Once again, as you guys can see, as I'm casting these words through these ideas and making these statements, because it's where I live, so to speak, that they appear to move in different directional, like you might pick up elements, fractious elements throughout what I'm saying. So I'm not expecting you to have a full strand of my internal dialogue or my particular consciousness as much as I would want you to empathize with where I'm coming from. Some people will pick up what I'm laying down. Other people will have nothing to do with it. And other people, they simply don't have the drive to want to go there, and they don't have the time to do that. Okay, so that being said, I'm at an hour and 4 minutes according to the clock. I'm going to read a couple comments here, and then I will chime off here. Let me read these quickly in silence, except for the hello one. So hello, Mr. Asgad and Salento. Okay, so Salento throws in a disagreement at a particular time. So he's objecting to something, but he mentions that he would argue that reason and logic are fundamental to the nature of ultimate reality. And okay, so then let me continue. Okay. Okay, so and then he's reductive to binaries, um, and I guess that's the yeah. Okay, so kind of the presencing or absenting of if one is a referent to a physical presence of, let's say, an atom or an appearance of some electrical expression at some spatial domain in the universe, and then it finds itself being absent, as if the coordinate system has a lock on what that X domain is, regardless of if it's the smallest domain possible. See, boy, just the words that I need right now are missing. So the presencing or absenting of something like in computer binary code, this individual's arguing that they believe that that is what is ultimate to reality, and that they're accepting that particular rudiment as the case. And I suppose to ask someone to find an opposite, first to not presence that idea always before someone's mind, but the idea that one comes to a particular conclusion again and again when the topic arises and they're forced to have focus on that domain. It would be hard pressed for me to like go to the bathroom by falling onto my stomach now and walking. So I mean, I accept certain certain basic praxis as positional grounding. I'm not trying to deny one's acceptance of saying zeros and ones are functioning in a binary way, but to ask oneself in what manner first does that come to mind, or when does it come to mind, and when it comes to mind, what is the conviction that that is the case, and then once one has answered those things, then to invite oneself to run contra to that idea. So, in contra to that idea, I could speculate and try to formulate a contra narrative such that whatever the spatial location or the demarcation of the presence, to find whether or not an electrical occurrence is presencing itself or not presencing itself, such as in a level of code, right? It would be hard pressed to speak about the presencing or a one appearing also being a zero at the same time, right? Then this would come down to the concept of erasure. What would it mean to fade, dislocate the one? To perhaps look at what the presencing of a one, what the term immediate presencing would look like. Like, is there a temporal gap between presencing and absenting in a particular domain? So first it would be looking at the structure of one's field and saying, oh, well, this particular code is occurring on my screen at this particular time, and the code is switching. And the one is there as long as the code is there. And then talking about what it would mean for that to change to a zero, or for that code or that electron to absent itself. And then to talk about the frame. Is the frame itself like a logical positivistic referent to the world, meaning trying to figure out what a workaround would be. For example, the idea of, oh, here's a bag, and in the bag are a number of gumballs, right? And the idea of saying, now the number of gumballs is either even or odd, right? Now, what would a contrarian approach to that say? How would I function in a dialogue about that if I wanted to run contra to the theme of, well, it would be neither the case, a fact, that there were even or odd gumballs in there, because there may be variants. There may be gumballs that have other gumballs stuck to them. There may be gumballs that fall so small that they're no longer considered a gumball, but that could be arguable depending on how large it was. So if one person sees a gumball that is not small, then all of a sudden the even odd attribution falls apart, where in the law of excluded middle, then Len falls to shame as the first of the principalic laws of thought, or laws of logic, right? Meaning, so it would even be arguable that at any given case, you didn't both have even and odd gumballs in there. But there's some sort of mental attribution or some sort of definitional aspect as to what referential numbers are speaking about. And then this brings up to when if I go, oh, hey, look, I have 2 cups, right? The idea of saying I have as the prerequisite caveat is interesting, right? And the idea of saying I have 2 cups, right? Like, you see, the domain of the discourse is what I'm bringing into the visual field and what my claim is. But my ownership of cups, I do not know how many that I actually have. So in the teaching field, right, when we're teaching what numbers are to kids, it's regularly within a radius, first, of the teacher's body, what the teacher is able to reference and pull together within a domain to speak about elements within the domain. And that this is kind of the brace of what it means to be human and develop rationality. There's a very a posteriori knowledge sets that we're using to build our rationality. And then it moves to pointing and reference and things outside of the domain of what is touchable, and then it's that which is outside of the empirical domain as well. So, and then there's the idea. So the idea of, I guess I can swing back to the whole thing of parsing away associative knowledge with empirical knowledge, and then trusting. At some point, we trust that there's things that we have never seen with our own eyes. We outrightly adhere and trust many of these things. And so this allows then a symbolic supplement to be present in our mind and refer to things like, things prior to witnessing evidence of, like a photograph of George Washington, right? You talk about, oh, there was a president prior to George Washington who was a black man, right? And there's even arguments that this was the case, or something like that, right? So we could talk about things in terms of, well, Jesus was never a real man on the planet. Oh no, he was a real historical figure, right? And so the idea of associating the supplemental, the supplement for the individual, and then associating that within one's worldview, that's the domain of the associative that I'm trying to make certain that I'm parsing away the narrative that comes along with associative knowledge from empirical, phenomenological knowledge that then that then I'm able to make ascriptions towards, right? So as opposed to inheriting a merely associative idea, it's first having experience and then developing ascriptions. So it's eisegesis versus exegesis, right? The associative domain, that which is all of the text that tells these narratives that one inherits, is then, and I say this is an inverted problem with theology, is that people are using other people's stories to be the ground of their theology, as opposed to having experiences, even though one is embedded within a lexical field of association, but first having empirical experiences to which they then ascribe these associative exegesis fields to. Anyway, what's going on? Okay, that being said, we're at 1:15, so thanks for listening as much as you did. Looks like we got 3 thumbs up so far and only 1 viewer. So 3, 2, 1, out. Cheers. Thanks. Hope this did something.